Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Bobbin's Minecraft Let's Play featuring the FTB Infinity Evolved Skyblock mod pack. Today I am at my new mob spawning operation here. It's right next to the old one. I wanted one where I did manual kill, because there are certain items that you can only get from manual kill, like mob heads and I guess these treasure bags and zombie brains and a few others. I'm also going to need at some point to capture some mob souls for making spawners and stuff. And so I went ahead and set up this facility right here, which is a separate spawn system, but instead of killing the mobs, it just drops them down this hole where they're sort of trapped in one block on top of this obsidian. Part of the reason for the obsidian is that occasionally creepers do blow up in this, and when they do, I don't want them destroying the surroundings and making me drop through the platform or anything like that. So I just have some obsidian here. They can destroy these cobblestone slabs, and I've had that happen. I actually died for the first time playing this mod pack between episodes here at this, because I had a creeper blow up, and one of these pieces of obsidian was not obsidian, it was darkened glass, so that I could see inside. And that got knocked out, and that left a hole big enough for creepers to come through and so on. I've replaced it with obsidian, but at some point I do want to be able to see what's in there, so I may have to devise some method here anyway. This actually hangs way out over the space here, and the reason for that is to give enough range so that mobs actually do spawn in here. Even if I'm standing right here, that's far enough away for mobs to spawn. The whole system can be turned off. There's a light system here to turn that off. And so that's sort of what's been going on here. In order to improve the head drops, I did go ahead and finally get around to making the Tinker's Construct tool forge, and I made a cleaver. So I have a cleaver. It's actually leveled up a couple of times. I did put an additional bit of beheading on it, so it's up to 30% beheading. So I'm getting a fair number of mob heads, and I've actually used those. I've made quite a bit of progress that I'm not going to go over today in Ender.io. I can now make all the conduits. I've got a slice and splice. I've automated the production of a couple of recipes in the slice and splice. I've got lots of alloy furnaces going, making the necessary alloys and some of the other materials that you need for Ender.io. I'm basically most of the way through the Ender.io progression. I'm ready to move on to Mine Factory Reloaded. I'm also not going to be doing that today because I do have two topics in particular I want to talk about that I think will be of interest. One of them is IC2 nuclear power, and the other is bees. So let me put this stuff away, and I will meet you over in the bee area where we're actually going to talk about nuclear power first. Alright, here I am on my platform where I do my bee breeding and my Botania, and I haven't really progressed very much on either one of those. We'll talk more about the bee breeding. The Botania just sort of peripherally as it relates to bee breeding. But let's talk about nuclear power first. There are two reasons for doing IC2 nuclear power in this particular mod pack. One of them is the obvious, to get power. In reality, there are lots of ways to get power here. The nuclear power is very convenient, but maybe not as essential for that purpose as it is for its other purpose. The other reason you use nuclear power is to get plutonium. And plutonium is essential for the progression, and it's very slow to produce because these nuclear plants run for hours on a single fuel charge, and once the fuel charge is recycled, it will produce plutonium, but it takes a long time to go through that whole cycle. So I'm actually going to have a lot of these nuclear reactors, like the one you see before me, in order to get the plutonium I need. They're all going to be set up really about the same. I'm not really doing anything very interesting with them. I got a design off of the IC2 message boards, which has several reactor designs on it. I sort of recommend going there. There is a thread that covers IC2 reactor design. I'm not going to talk about any designs other than the one that I chose to use here and the slight change that I made to it. So let's take a look at that. We have a reactor here. One of the things you can do in IC2 is you can expand the amount of space in your reactor by adding additional chambers to the outside of it. This doesn't have any additional chambers, so this is just the base reactor. And if we look inside, we're going to see that we have 3 columns of things we can put in it. Additional chambers would open up these other columns, one at a time, one per chamber. Inside here, this very basic design consists of the overclocked heat vents, which there are 8 of, and the dual fuel rod in here, and these are uranium. We'll talk about a different kind of fuel rod you can use. I have added to this design some reactor plating, and the reason that I've done that has nothing to do with making the reactor run any better or safer or anything like that. This is already a very safe design that will sit there and run indefinitely as long as it's fueled properly and nothing happens to it to mess it up. The reason for adding the reactor plating is to make sure that every slot is filled. And the reason I want to do that is because I'm using logistics pipes to refuel this thing and to extract the extra fuel from it. So if we look at the logistics pipe configuration on this thing, there's an active supplier which is supplying dual fuel rod uranium. Only one of them. Logistics pipes distinguishes between the various damage values on these fuel rods. So if you tell it to only put one in, it will actually completely fill the reactor with these rods, or at least it will fill every available space. That's why we filled up all the spaces we didn't want fuel rods to go into. So you just have to have one and it will fill up the whole thing as long as it can automatically craft fuel rods and so on, which I've set up automatic crafting for that. That's kind of a no-brainer. It does involve a canning machine, and you've got to have a thermal centrifuge, refining uranium, and some stuff like that. I probably won't cover that in too much detail because it's all pretty straightforward. You should be able to look it up in NEI. It is request mode partial, so it will always, if there isn't one in there, it will always go and put one in there. Then on the provider module, this is providing depleted uranium dual fuel rods, which basically, this is the exhausted fuel. This, on the uranium fuel rods, this thing will run for something like 2.5 to 3 hours. It runs for a long time before it completely exhausts the fuel. That whole time, this particular configuration is generating 120 EU per tick, which should be around 300 RF per tick if once you do the conversion through these immersive engineering connectors. It looks to me like it might actually be generating a little bit more. It's kind of hard to say. I've got another reactor that's only got one fuel rod in it. It seems to be generating more than I expect in terms of RF. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But going back in here, so what we want to do is we want to put a provider module on here to tell it to make these things available on the network. A critical point here is that you have something in here, because if this is empty, it's going to provide everything in here, and you could actually rip out some of the things like the heat vents whenever you went and request some across the network, like you want to make a new reactor and you want to make the components for it. And if that happened, this reactor would overheat and blow up, and you definitely don't want that. As long as you don't make any sort of really kind of dumb mistakes on that sort of thing, this reactor design is extremely stable. There are other reactor designs, and you might choose to use them. I'm not saying this is the best one, use this one. And if you do that, you may decide that something is more efficient than another reactor design and go with that. Truth be told, having looked at the various circumstances, I have decided that efficiency on these reactors is of absolutely no interest to me. This one right here is generating, like I said, probably around 300 RF per tick, and there's no buffering or anything on it. None of these machines are even using any power at all right now. It's just sitting here burning fuel. You can actually make it go into some sort of storage, and when the storage is full, turn off the reactor. It is redstone controllable. You actually have to have this lever on it or some other sort of redstone signal to tell it to run at all. So it is redstone controllable to turn on and off, and when it turns off, it obviously doesn't use any fuel. You can make your system much more efficient. The goal for this, though, is not necessarily to produce energy in the most efficient way. The goal is to produce plutonium, and preferably lots of it. Right now, I've got, I think, 5 of these reactors set up around the base. This one is specifically providing power for these B-related machines, and all but one of them are using uranium fuel rods. Let's talk about the other fuel rod for a minute, because over the long run I'll be using this other fuel rod. So right here, this is the manual crafting area where if I want to use some of these machines to craft something manually, I've got them all here. They've got power. This used to be connected to the central power coming from the boiler and the biogas engines over there. It's not anymore. I did go ahead and set up a reactor for it. This reactor is actually feeding on one side a vibrant capacitor bank. I am able to make these automatically now because I've got all the alloys and materials I need, and I've set it all up in the system. I have a lot of recipes in the system now. This reactor outputs onto this glass fiber cable, which is an IC2 cable, and then I'm using an immersive engineering connector to connect it over to these 2 machines. The nice thing about this is this does a voltage conversion, so I'm going to get low voltage out of here, and I don't have to worry about blowing up these machines. Because they're IC2 machines and they do care about voltage, these machines over here all run on RF. RF-oriented machines don't care anything about the amount of power you feed them. They just take what power is available, and there you go. This reactor is running a dual fuel rod, and it says MOX, which I believe stands for mixed oxides, instead of uranium. This dual fuel rod is made from plutonium, and the reason you use this one is you actually get the plutonium that you put into it back, plus some more plutonium that you got as a result of running it through here. And the amount of plutonium you get on the net for this, once you calculate up how much you put in and how much you got out, is exactly the same as the amount that you get at from recycling the uranium fuel rods. The difference is this one burns up twice as fast. So as a consequence of that, you're actually producing plutonium twice as fast by using these, but you have to actually invest some of your plutonium in creating these fuel rods to begin with. At the moment, I only have enough plutonium to create 1 mixed oxide dual fuel rod. That's all that it's running on. And that's one of the reasons that it's on this particular system with some energy storage, is because 20 RF or 20 EU, which should be around 50 RF, but if you look over here it looks like it's around 66 or so, is not a lot of power. But it is enough to run these machines that I don't run very often, as long as there's some storage on them. So that's what's going on there. This one is about to be depleted. After it is depleted, what will happen to it is it will go down over here, and it will go into the thermal centrifuge. Now, I made the thermal centrifuge in the last episode, or maybe the episode before that. Can't quite remember exactly when I made it, but it's here, and it's cycling certain items, including depleted fuel rods. And when this machine runs on a fuel rod, it will give you a mixture of plutonium and uranium-238 and iron dust, which you can then take and recycle to get some of those materials back. And of course the plutonium, that's where you're getting it from, is you're getting it from this thermal centrifuge. I showed you the ore washing plant before. Technically you don't have to have the ore washing plant to produce everything you need for this mod pack. You do have to have the thermal centrifuge though. I haven't seen yet that you need more than one. I might end up setting more than one at some point. You will notice that this has a medium voltage wire connector on it going up here. This machine is capable of using medium voltage. It has a lever on it that causes it to retain heat at all times, so it stays hot. That makes it a little more responsive when you get new stuff coming in. And so that is basically nuclear power. Choose a safe design and set it up correctly, and you will never have to worry about explosions. You're not going to have to do anything special with timing and redstone signals other than just one to turn it on. And it's actually very reasonable to run. It produces quite a bit of power, and so what's going to happen over the long run is most of the base will actually be running off of these reactors. This sort of central power system that's sending power over long distances through these pipes will actually go away because I just won't have any real need for it to be sending power everywhere, because each location will have its own set of reactors. The fuel will just come across the logistics pipe network, and there you go. Alright, so coming back down here to look at bees. Well, before we do that, let me go ahead and mention I did create a QED. The QED has one component in its recipe that is a real pain, which is the machine frame resonant. Normally when you make the thermal expansion machines, you can use just the regular basic machine frame, and then you can upgrade the machine and you don't need the resonant machine frame. For this one, because it is in the crafting recipe itself, you very specifically need the resonant machine frame, and it requires assembly in an assembly table, and it requires 50 million RF to make. So I'm going to be working on my lasers sometime soon. I have 10 of them right now in the same configuration you saw before. I just added a few more, and this took a long time to make. So just be aware there are some things that are slow to make. Okay, here I am in my Botania and beekeeping area, and through the miracle of video editing, the rain has stopped. Actually, I was not satisfied with the previous take on this segment, and so I'm redoing it, but be that as it may, let's talk a little bit about how you get the bees that you want and so on. Your first step in beginning bee breeding is to actually get some bees. And there are two ways to do this, both of which I've already talked about. One I talked about quite a bit. I talked about how you make the hives in either the fluid transposer or the induction furnace, I believe it was, the thermal expansion machine that combines the ores. Anyway, both of those are ways that you will want to use. You will want to use the production and breaking of hives in order to get most of your bee stock, because that's the best way to get princesses, and it lets you control what you're getting. The other method is to use the hive ascent, which is this flower right here. Now, I didn't talk about it too much. This flower consumes a lot of mana. If I were to flip the switch here and turn this flower on, it is redstone controllable, then very slowly, like one every 5 or 6 seconds, something like that, a bee would drop on the ground somewhere in the immediate vicinity, and I could run and pick it up. The process actually uses a great deal of mana, so it'll completely drain this pool probably within maybe 10 minutes or so of doing that if it was full. But anyway, this will produce a whole bunch of different species of bees, and I'll show you in just a minute my chest full of bees, and you will understand you do want this flower because it will produce a lot of different species of bees, including some you can't get through creation of hives. Now, the other flower that I find particularly interesting for bee breeding is this begonia, or begonia is probably more appropriate, because the begonia makes bees gone. It actually will take your drones that you have produced that you don't want, your junk drones, and inevitably, if you've ever done any bee breeding, you've noticed you end up with just tons of junk drones that you don't want. Well, the begonia will consume them and convert them into mana for Botania. So they basically act as fuel. They don't produce as much mana as, let's say, coal or charcoal going through the endoflame, but the mechanism is actually very similar. Essentially, the flower consumes a bee that's sitting on the ground, which is why I have not turned the hive ascent on, and it produces a small amount of mana over a period of time, which can then go into a mana pool. The actual mechanism, different Botania flowers that generate mana do it a little bit different. The mechanism for the begonia is really exactly the same as for the endoflame. So if I were to just go and put some drones in here, they would drop down one at a time on the plate and they would all be consumed. So that's how that works. After you have used that flower, and I ran probably between 2 and 3 pools of mana through it, and I got all these bees, and there are a lot of them in here. There might have been a few more. I've pulled a few bees out and I've put some drones in, and so this is not exactly what you would get, but it's pretty close. What you see here is a big collection of different species of bees. Some of them, like the sorceress, I don't have a recipe for the hive for that yet. I think there might be one through Thaumcraft, but obviously I haven't even started Thaumcraft, so I don't have the appropriate runic altar for going and making that, if you can do that at all. I haven't looked in the Thaumonomicon. The Embittered, that comes out of the Nether Hive. You can certainly make that one. The Oblivion Princess. This, I think, comes from a hive in the end in the normal game scenario. I don't know how you would get that here. There might be a recipe for it. Your next step in bee breeding, call it step 2, is to get combs. You need combs because you're going to be using this beealizer, and combs, honey is what fuels it, and honey comes from combs. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's see, combs, the best way to get combs really in the early game is to create a bunch of these bee houses. Don't use the apiary because bees in the apiary are not very productive unless you invest a bunch of time in frames and loading them up. Use the bee house. The bee house is manual, so my suggestion would be that you get the bees going in it. You'll probably be using like forest bees or meadow bees, anything that will work in this climate without any breeding. And this is a deep ocean biome, so it has normal temperature and humidity. We'll talk about those attributes in just a minute, but you run them through here, come back every 20 minutes or so, and just recycle the princess and pull out the combs. And you'll be ready to go when you've got about a stack of combs. Once you have your combs, your next step, and actually you can do this while you're collecting combs. So instead of calling this step 3, why don't we call it step 2.5? Because you can do it at the same time you're doing your combs. And that's to make some basic machines that you're going to need in order to do the bee breeding process. The first of these should be a beealizer. You already have a carpenter. This is made through a carpenter recipe. And it uses water as the fluid, and the most expensive component in it is a diamond. It's pretty easy. Once you have that, you also want to make a bunch more bee houses, as I already mentioned. I have, looks like maybe 6 bee houses here. Something to be aware of when you're producing your combs is if you have more bees and bee houses, it goes faster because you have more bees working at once. That's the easiest way to improve production, is just to have more bees. So do keep that in mind. I've got 6, and I also created some apiaries, but there's nothing, if you want a lot of combs and you want them soon, there's nothing keeping you from running 20 or 30 or 50 or however many bee houses you can put up with managing manually. You've only got to go back and check them maybe every 20 minutes or so and recycle the bees. In the meantime, you do other things because there's no sense standing over these things while the bees work. That's just tedious. Alright, the next machine you're going to need, you are going to need some apiaries, so go ahead and make some. The apiary has a slightly different recipe than you might expect if you are not familiar with bees. This is the apiary, and it looks pretty ordinary. It's just done in a crafting table, but this thing in the center, the impregnated casing, is a carpenter recipe. It's made from logs and a carpenter, and instead of using water as the working fluid, it uses seed oil, which brings us to the next machine you're going to need. You're going to need a squeezer because that is the machine that seed oil is made in. The squeezer makes seed oil from any kind of seeds you like. You can tell mine is full of pumpkin seeds. There's a reason that I use pumpkin. Pumpkin is very productive for producing seeds because you can just combine a pumpkin in the crafting window to get 4 seeds. So you can imagine if you've got stacks and stacks of pumpkins, and it is easy to grow that many, that you can get an enormous amount of pumpkin seeds. The next one you're going to need after those, and I do have another carpenter set up here, one that specifically fills up with seed oil for crafting these things. The next item you're going to need after that, the next machine, is a centrifuge. The centrifuge is what you put the combs in in order to get the drops of honey. You toss the comb in there and it breaks down into the various things that are extractable from the comb, which includes wax, honey. The last machine that I suggest making, just as you're getting started, is from the genetics mod. It's called the acclimatizer. The acclimatizer is actually the only machine that I plan on making from the genetics mod. If you're familiar with the genetics mod and you want to actually go and manipulate your bees in more detail earlier before you have the opportunity to get Gendustry, or maybe you just prefer genetics over Gendustry, I don't, but I can't say that that's true for everyone, then you may make more machines than I do. But the acclimatizer is an important one because it will let you adjust the temperature tolerance and humidity tolerance of the bees. And that will allow you to breed a whole lot more bees in this particular climate. If you need a hot climate, you can go to the nether. That is an option, but you'll find yourself going back and forth between here and the nether, and you'll have to build a platform in the nether because there's nothing in the nether. You can do that, and you will have to do that because certain bees are crossbred in the nether, but I don't think you want to go back and forth if you don't have to. So it would be better if you could breed your bees here to have an appropriate temperature tolerance and humidity tolerance. If you needed a cold climate, I think the end is a cold climate. That's a little extreme just for breeding bees, but you could possibly do it, I guess. Another alternative would be to go and find some other biome. This general area that we're in right here is a deep ocean biome, but if you were to go far enough away from here, you would find other biomes. I know that there are other biomes that surround this. I've been over in the witchery spirit world that mirrors this and seen where they're all located. They're quite a ways from here, except for some little isolated bits of plains or whatever that are on islands. For the most part, I don't recommend that approach. You will have to build platforms hundreds of blocks just exploring in order to find them. Certainly a possibility, probably better just to acclimate the bees. So step 3 is actually to breed for the early attributes. You're not really breeding to produce new species at this point. You're just trying to establish a bee that you can use as a model. And you'll notice on this chest here, I've got one labeled Model Bees with nothing in it because I haven't finished yet. The process you want to use here, in my opinion, and you might find that you have a different opinion, that's fine. But I think the best way to do it is actually to start with a rocky drone and a wintry princess. Now I do want you to use a rocky drone and a wintry princess. I'm going to use a wintry drone as a stand-in because I don't have a wintry princess handy. But do bear in mind that this would normally be a princess. If we look at the default attributes on these bees using the Beealyzer, on the first page we're going to find a whole bunch of basic attributes that affect the lifespan of the bee, the productivity of the bee in various ways, the fertility of the bee, which affects how many drones you get out of it, how big its territory it is, and if it has an effect. Most of these you're not that interested in at this point. It would be nice to eliminate any detrimental effects, which none of these have an effect that's detrimental to you, the player. Or these two don't have any effect that's detrimental to you, the player. You do, in the final analysis, want fertility 4, not fertility 1, though. This is how many drones it will produce when the queen dies and produces a princess and a variable number of drones. In this case, you're with the rocky bee at its default attributes, you will get 1 princess and 1 drone. When you're crossing bees, you want as many drones as you can get because that gives you more to choose from in picking the one that best matches the attributes that you're looking for. With just 1, you're stuck at it. 1 is a terrible fertility number. You don't want it. Another thing to notice on here is that some of the attributes are in red. These are what you would consider dominant attributes, and that means that the one here in the first column actually governs the behavior of the bee. The ones that are in blue are recessive attributes, and if something has a mix of a dominant and a recessive attribute, the dominant one will always be the one that governs the bee's behavior. In general, this stuff in column 1 governs the bee's behavior, but do bear in mind if you've got a recessive attribute, I think it's actually forced over into the first column for display purposes, even if really it should be in the second one. Just keep that in mind. The reason for choosing the Rocky drone is actually because of all the attributes on this second page. It has temperature tolerance both 1, and it has humidity tolerance both 1. And then it's nocturnal, which means it will work at night, tolerant flyer, which means it will work in the rain, and cave dwelling, which means that it doesn't have to see the sky in order to work. These middle two, nocturnal and tolerant flyer, are must-haves for bee breeding, because otherwise every time it rains or every time it gets dark, your bees just stop working, and that is really a drag. The other two, the tolerances, you want both. It doesn't matter what they are on the bee that you pick, but I'm suggesting that you pick the Rocky drone since it's got both 1 in all of these slots by default. You do want it as the drone, and the reason you want it as the drone is because the behavior of the bee is governed by the genes that are expressed by the princess. And if you have the Rocky drone, then you will have a chance of crossing in all of these attributes on the second page, but your first cross will actually produce more than one drone, because the drone's genes don't affect the way that they don't affect the behavior of the queen and the hive. Okay, for your princess, you're going to use a wintry. And I'm showing a wintry drone, but like I said, this would be a princess in what you would want to do. The attributes that are of interest here are fertility, which is 4. The freezing effect, what that does is it causes any standing water nearby to have a chance to convert to ice. Probably inconvenient. I would consider this to be a detrimental attribute, but you, the player, won't necessarily notice it unless you have standing water nearby, which probably isn't very likely on a Skyblock. Do keep that in mind if you're growing it next to a crop field or something, and you might have to worry about your crops drying out. You will notice that the fertility is a recessive attribute, which means that when you cross these bees on the next generation you get back, you'll have 1 on one side from the Rocky drone, and you'll have 4 on the other from the wintry princess, and that bee will actually functionally be a 1. When you cross it back and forth several times, you will be able to eliminate the 1 and replace it with one that's 4 in both of them. And that's part of the goal of the early breeding. On the next page, the wintry one has climate tolerance icy up 1, and we're going to have to boost this. It has humidity tolerance both 1, and then these other attributes all say no, and we don't want that. We want to go ahead and adjust these to yes, and that's going to be part of our goal in crossing these bees. So you've got your princess, which can simply come from breaking a hive if you're not getting it from the hive ascent, and you've got your drone, and you're going to cross them. But before you cross them, you're going to come over to the acclimatizer, and I've got a bee in here that I was working with earlier, and there are 3 items that you need to have besides your princess and your drone. You need to have several stacks of sand handy, you should have several stacks of ice handy, and you should have, I suggest 1 stack of lava cans, but you might have to go back and get more. Do understand that. Sand is used to adjust humidity tolerance so that the bee will tolerate a drier climate. The catch on it, though, is that if the bee has attributes both rather than just down, what it will actually do is it will adjust in both directions simultaneously. Now this one has both 1 still, but the temperature tolerance or climate tolerance has been adjusted. You'll see one of them's both 4 and one of them's both 2. You may have some trouble keeping these balanced. Your goal is ideally to have everything on this page at both 3. The acclimatizer will adjust them all the way up to both 5. You shouldn't need that in a deep ocean climate since it's a middle-of-the-road climate. But more importantly, I'm not really sure what Gendustry will do when you get that if you breed all of your bees to have both 5. I haven't researched it. I would say since it's not necessary and I don't know what it will do, and nobody does until they go and research it. Maybe somebody does know and would like to post. Really, probably just settle for both 3, and because it will always work. So this bee has been adjusted a little bit. This was done using ice. Ice actually adjusts the temperature tolerance down, meaning it will tolerate a lower temperature. But since it said both to begin with, it actually widens it out in both directions because you can't actually have a both and a down at the same time. Sand does the same thing for humidity tolerance. Technically, it makes it more suited for a dry climate, but if you've got a both in that slot, then obviously in that case it expands it in both directions, so it makes it more versatile altogether. On the rocky bee, you're going to use sand and ice because you can expand in both directions simultaneously. If we go back to the wintry drone, you can use sand to adjust the humidity tolerance. For the climate tolerance, you would actually be making yourself worse off if you used ice. This is why you use lava cans instead. You're aiming to get at least up to here so that you can, and you must get up to at least so that you can actually raise the bee in this particular climate. It may actually require up 3. I would certainly try for up 3. Up to, I would say, has a pretty good chance of working, but you can find out for sure if you want to research it. I haven't, but up 3 will definitely get you a princess that you can raise in this climate. And so that's what you want to do. You want to adjust those. The next thing you want to do is you want to cross them. And you want to be sure that you cross them in a bee house. And I've got a bee house here that I've been doing that in for a while. Let me see what's going on in that bee house. Okay, I've crossed them a few times here, so I've been adjusting things. Let's talk about how to get your bees bred to what you want in as few crosses as possible. It will probably still take you a good 10 or 15 times to get the bee that you want here. The goal is to produce that with one bee that you can then use as a model so that you can cross it through in the future, and you will have all the attributes you need without having to do quite so much work on every bee. Because right now you don't have Gendustry available. This whole process becomes so much easier once you do have Gendustry, but the goal here is to complete a quest that will open up Gendustry for you. So let me take each one of these bees and analyze them. Now, if you're short on honey, and I'm not right now, but if you are short on honey, you can skip analyzing the princess because there's only one. That's the one you're compelled to use no matter what. I am going to analyze it to check my progress. Now what I do is I score the bee. I just count the number of attributes that it has that match the goal that I'm after. Right now, I don't really care what species it is. I would be satisfied with either rocky or wintry. I don't care about lifespan or production or pollination or flower type. I will care about all of these things eventually, but I just don't care now because it's not the goal. So the first thing I care about is fertility. So I'm basically going to count 1, 2, because it's got fertility in both slots. Don't care about territory. I do like that it has the effect none, so that's 3, but not 4 because it's freezing over here. So it's got the attributes. So on the first page we have a score of 3. Continuing on to the next page, I want all the both 3s, so 4, 5, 6, and then I'm looking at these bottom 6 here, and that'll take it up to 12. So this bee scores 12. And I've got a chest set up here with bees arranged by score. It helps to use some item that you don't have a shortage of as a counter to keep track of them. So I'm just going to put that down next to the 12. Now let's score the drones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is a good drone. Alright, this one is also a 12. It's not as nice a 12 for a reason that may or may not be obvious. The thing is, it's both of the tolerant flyers say no, which means that no matter what I cross this bee with, no is guaranteed to be in one of the slots on the descendants. Otherwise it scores very well. It's got really everything else. The maximum would be 14 with the attributes that I'm doing, and it's got 12, so it's only short by 2. But I think for now, while I am going to put it in the same slot with the 12s, I'm going to keep in mind that I don't really want this bee as my first choice. You can lose attributes if you have too many of those. So this one's only a 10. And what we've gotten by this scoring process is I've discovered which bees I need to cross. So I'm going to take the princess, which I would always have to take, and I'm not going to take this last 12 over here because I knew I didn't want that one. I'm just going to take these two bees and put them back over in here. And they'll cross over to create a new queen, and I will be waiting for it to work. And one of the nice things about this one is that it didn't give me any sort of logos like this, not daytime. It has nocturnal. So this bee is actually working right now. It is necessary when you're doing this process that you use the bee house. The bee house is very slow, but if you don't use the bee house, if you use the apiary instead, one of the differences between the bee house and the apiary is that in the apiary, bees can cross to create a new species. Now, if that's what you're trying to do, then obviously you need to use the apiary. But in this case, we're not trying to do that. The particular bees we're using, the Rocky and the Wintry, actually will cross to form a common bee. If that happens, then we'll start to get the default attributes of the common bee mixed in with what we're working with, and it will complicate things. You can, if you keep crossing those things with the common bees, you can find yourself with a cultivated. We will want common and cultivated eventually, but we don't want it now. At the moment, we're just trying to get either the Rocky or the Wintry, and preferably both, set up with exactly the same attributes that we're specifically looking to get right now. As we get new bees, we'll update our model bees, and eventually we will have a good system of bees that will actually work 24 hours a day, rain or shine, that will definitely work in this climate, and we'll be able to transfer those attributes over to other bees through the laborious process of crossbreeding, and that's what we want. Eventually what's going to happen is we do have a goal. The goal is to get this bee, the Infinity Queen. The Infinity Queen produces a comb, the Infinity Comb, that can be processed in the centrifuge, and it will give a power module. The power module is a core component of the Gendustry mod. Without it, you can't do anything in Gendustry. So breeding this bee unlocks Gendustry. And the nice thing about Gendustry, if you haven't used it before, is it makes this whole process that I've just got done explaining just ridiculously easy by comparison. You have machines, you give them power, you can mutate the particular species you want, you can build a sort of a template card that has a particular set of attributes associated with it, and you can basically just stamp your bees with the attributes you want, and you don't have to go through all the process of crossbreeding to accumulate to do that. You still have some of this breeding going on, but it's not nearly as time-consuming and laborious as what you would have doing it the way that I've just described. So I hope that you have success with your bees if you're working on them. If you don't like bees, well, I'm sorry I spent so much of the episode talking about them. I do understand they can be a bit of a time-sinky thing to do. That is bee breeding this time around. I hope that you do find it useful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.